Hello and welcome to this talk in TESOL Academic. My name is Kostoulas and I work in the ELT Research and Methodology section in the Institute for English Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. I am here at the kind invitation of Hugh Jarvis to talk about an article entitled 15 Years of Research on Self and Identity in System that I wrote together with Professor Sarah Mercer. The article, which appeared in the August 2016 issue of System, serves as the introduction to a virtual special issue, or VSI, on self and identity. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I will very briefly explain what a VSI is and why we felt that a VSI on the self was important. I will talk you through the process of creating such a virtual special issue and discuss some of the main insights that we've gained about the self from the process of putting together the virtual special issue. And I will conclude by sharing why I think that research on the self is important to us as language educators. A virtual special issue, or VSI, is essentially a collection of articles that have been published in a journal focusing on a specific topic or central theme. The function of a VSI is to bring together in a common online space empirical work that has been published in different issues that are sometimes separated by the space of many years. By virtue of this format, a VSI lends itself very well to tracing how ideas or constructs or techniques or theories develop across time. So for example, in February 2016, System published a VSI on computer-assisted language learning, edited by Ursula Stickler and Li Jingxi, in which they show how computer-assisted language learning gradually became normalized in language teaching. In our own VSI, we wanted to focus on a construct that is very central in language learning psychology, the construct of self and identity. That is to say, how we tend to think of ourselves as language learners or language teachers or teacher educators. And our motivation for doing so was grounded on the observation that in the last 15 years or so, there seems to be a dramatic increase in the number of publications focusing on the self. This is a trend that appears to have begun in the year 2000, following the publication of Bonnie Norton's seminal book on identity and language learning. And it has certainly picked up space in the last 10 years or so, following the publication of Zoltan Dornier's Psychology of the Language Learner in 2005. This is not to say that there hasn't been any research on the self or related constructs extending back into the 90s or even earlier in some cases, but the number of publications focusing on the self seems to have increased exponentially over the last 15 years or so. Now, this is of course a very welcome development, but it seems that the price we have had to pay for this increased interest is that there appears to be a certain conceptual inconsistency in the way we tend to think about the self, and there certainly is a lot of terminological inconsistency in the way we describe the self. And we feel that this lack of coherence in the literature can, in some instances, it can act as an impediment to future research, and it certainly makes the existing literature less accessible than it could perhaps be. So our reason for putting together this VSI was to essentially take stock of where the field currently is and to trace connections between different ways of thinking about the self, and also perhaps even to speculate about the future forms and priorities that self-research might take. The first step in putting together the VSI involved defining the time frame that our review would cover. Now, as I just said, there is some research on constructs similar to the self or connected to the self, like metacognition or personal knowledge, and this research extends well into the 90s. But we believe that the publication in the year 2000 of Bonnie Norton's book on identity and language learning represents a very salient milestone in the way in which the self is understood, or in the way in which our understanding of the self has developed. And I'll talk some more about why this is the case shortly, but what we did was select the year 2000 as the starting point of our review because it was the year in which Bonnie Norton's book was published. Now, going through the archives of System, we found that from the year 2000 onwards, there are about 40 research articles focusing on the self or on identity or on constructs that are more or less directly connected to them, and we included all those articles in our review. But then, for the purposes of the VSI as such, we needed to narrow down this selection to just 10 articles. And this was a very challenging process, to be honest, because we didn't want to rely exclusively on the so-called objective criteria, like the number of citations each article had received and things like that. Rather, what we wanted to do was to use the VSI as a vehicle for representing or showcasing the vast diversity that research on the self has taken. So our choice of articles really reflects this decision. We've tried to include articles that are premised on different theoretical understandings of the self, and we've included articles that use different research methodologies like longitudinal studies or case studies and so on to research the self. And we've included articles that focus on different populations like learners or teachers and so on. So we've tried to be very inclusive in our criteria. And I should also stress that our selection criteria were not in any way connected to value judgments, so I don't really want to imply that articles that were not included in the collection were in any way less important than those that were included. That's not really the way we worked. In part 3 of our article, we have summaries of each article that is included in the VSI, and we also explain in a few brief lines why each article was chosen. And because all this information is there already, I don't want to repeat it in this talk. Rather, I want to go on and discuss some of the main findings or insights that emerged from our literature. One thing that we learned from our review is that research into the self and identity seems to be punctuated by 3 major milestones. The first of these milestones, which I mentioned previously, is the publication in the year 2000 of Bonnie Norton's book on identity and language learning. Now, the reason why this book is so salient is because it represents, or it signals rather, a major theoretical shift in the way in which people have tended to think about the self. So, prior to the publication of this book, much of the research conducted in constructs similar to the self has tended to view these constructs as individual differences or as one out of many variables that need to be accounted for in order to better understand learning outcomes. But what Bonnie Norton's book does is essentially bring the construct of the self into center stage and to examine in detail how identities are socially constructed and how people's investment in these identities impacts language learning. The second milestone that we identified was the publication in 2005 of Zoltan Dornier's book, The Psychology of the Language Learner. And this is a notable book because it outlines the L2 motivational self system. The impact of this book in self-research seems to have taken the form of an almost explosive increase in the number of publications connected to the self. In our review, for instance, there were almost a third of the articles that we studied explicitly acknowledged Dornier's L2 motivational self system, either in their research design or as a frame for the interpretation of their findings. So that seems to have had a very major impact. And the third milestone that we identified was the publication in 2015 of The Psychology of the Language Learner Revisited by Zoltan Dornier and Stephen Ryan. And what we think is, we view this book as representative of a broader theoretical shift towards understandings of the self that are more dynamic, more situated and more relational than past research. Now, since this book has only just been published, it hasn't actually had any noticeable impact that we can speak of yet, but we think it is quite reasonable to expect that it will have a major impact on the way the self is understood and researched into the future. Something else that we noticed in the literature that we reviewed is that this 15-year period evidences traces both of continuity and of evolution in the way in which the self is understood and studied. So one such strand of continuity connects to Bonnie Norton's theory of identity and investment. So across the 15-year period, there are a number of studies that are informed by Bonnie Norton's work. Much to our surprise, however, the influence of Bonnie Norton's theory is not quite as visible in system as it is in other journals or elsewhere in the literature. And we are not quite sure why this might be the case. We might perhaps hypothesize that in the past, system might have been viewed or perceived as a more quantitatively oriented journal and perhaps not the most appropriate venue for publishing work on identity. But that's just speculation. We don't really know what the reason might be. What is definitely a fact is that there are articles across the 15-year period providing one strand of continuity. A second strand of continuity connects to self-efficacy research. So across the 15-year period, studies of self-efficacy appear quite regularly. So that's another strand. There are several such strands across the data. At the same time, we also witnessed the emergence of certain new trends. So, for example, when talking about the 3 milestones, I mentioned a trend towards understandings of the self that are more dynamical or more contextualized or more situated. And this is also evident in the increase in, for example, longitudinal research, which is presumably intended to capture some of the dynamism of complex understandings of the self. So there's both continuity and change. That's interesting. And the third thing that we noticed is that most of the research on the self published in System focuses on language learners. So we talk about learner self and learner identity more frequently than we talk about teacher self and teacher identity. Similarly, the range of constructs that have been studied in connection to the learner self is much larger than the range of constructs that have been studied for teachers. Now, in many ways, this is an expected and welcome development when we consider it in connection to learner-centeredness. We are, however, concerned that this neglect of the teacher, this imbalance in the research, may be in some ways unhelpful. So we would welcome more studies focusing in the way language teachers think or feel about themselves. The final point I want to make in this talk connects to the value of self and identity research. So why is it important to think about identity, whether we consider ourselves as language learners or language teachers or teacher educators? And my starting point in making this argument is that our understanding or our perception of ourselves is fundamental in building our dispositions, our beliefs, our values, and our motivations, and ultimately our behavior. An understanding of the learner's self is a necessary condition in order to be able to support our learners to further develop their strengths, and in order to challenge those beliefs that they may have which are unhelpful. A nuanced understanding of our own self as teachers is important if we want to build relationships with our students that are authentic and productive. This is why we believe that research on the self is useful and valuable, and we hope that the article we wrote and the VSI in general are helpful entry points for people who are interested in learning more about this construct. We also hope that they are useful in inspiring or prompting additional research on the self. So I hope the article is useful to you, and I hope this talk was useful and interesting as well. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.